I still remember the exact moment my world stopped making sense. It wasn't a dramatic scene. No shouting, no slamming doors, just a quiet Tuesday night, the glow of a laptop screen, and a hotel reservation that was never meant for me. My name is Ellen Mercer. I was married for 12 years to a man I thought I knew completely. I built my life around that certainty. Then a woman named Rachel Donnelly walked into his office, and everything I believed in started falling apart, one lie at a time. If this story moves you, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. I never thought much about the people Daniel worked with. After 12 years of marriage, I had learned that his office world and our home world were two separate things. He would come through the front door, loosen his tie, and leave the stress of the logistics company somewhere between the parking lot and our kitchen. That was how we functioned. That was our routine. We lived in Cedar Falls, a quiet suburb outside of Columbus, Ohio. Nothing extraordinary about our neighborhood. Rows of similar houses, similar lawns, similar lives. We had a mortgage, 2 car payments, and a joint savings account that never seemed to grow as fast as we wanted. Daniel worked as an operations manager. I worked part-time at a dental office and handled most of what needed handling at home. It wasn't a perfect life, but it felt solid. It felt like ours. The first time he mentioned her name, we were having dinner. A Wednesday. Pasta. The television was on in the background. Some news program neither of us was actually watching. Daniel was telling me about a problem at work, a scheduling conflict that had been causing delays for weeks. We finally figured it out, he said, twirling his fork. Rachel helped map the whole thing out. She's sharp, really sharp. Rachel, I asked, new hire, transferred from the Cincinnati branch. She's been with the company about 3 weeks. I nodded and reached for my glass of water. That was it. That was the entire conversation. 30 seconds, maybe less. I didn't feel anything. No alarm, no instinct telling me to pay closer attention. Rachel was just a name, a colleague who had helped solve a scheduling problem. Nothing more. But names have a way of returning. The following week, she came up again. Daniel mentioned that Rachel had suggested a new tracking system for their warehouse routes. His tone was casual, almost enthusiastic, the way he used to talk about work when we first got married. Back when everything about his career still excited him. Sounds like she knows what she's doing, I said. She really does, he replied, and then he smiled at his phone. I noticed the smile. I told myself it meant nothing. The week after that, Rachel came up twice. Once over breakfast, once during a phone call I overheard while folding laundry. He was laughing, a loose, easy laugh that I hadn't heard in a long time. Not with me, anyway. I stood in the hallway holding a folded shirt, listening to a sound that used to belong to us. I didn't say anything. I walked back to the bedroom, put the shirt in the drawer, and sat on the edge of the bed for a moment. Something small had shifted. I couldn't name it yet, but I felt it. Daniel had never been protective of his phone. For 12 years, that device sat on the kitchen counter, on the bathroom shelf, on his side of the bed, always within reach, never hidden. I had known his passcode since the year we got married, not because I ever felt the need to check it, but because that was simply how we lived. No walls, no secrets. At least that was what I believed. The change was gradual, so gradual that I almost missed it. It started with small things. He began carrying his phone in his front pocket instead of leaving it on the counter. When it buzzed during dinner, he would glance at the screen and turn it face down without a word. When I walked into the room while he was typing, his fingers would slow down, just slightly, before he locked the screen. None of it was dramatic. None of it was obvious, but I noticed. One evening in late October, I was in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner when his phone lit up on the table. He had stepped outside to check on something in the garage. The notification appeared for just a second before the screen went dark, long enough for me to see a first name, Rachel. I stood there with a dish towel in my hands and stared at the black screen. I told myself it was work. A message about schedules, routes, warehouse logistics. Completely reasonable. They were colleagues. Of course they communicated outside of office hours sometimes. I put the dish towel down and finished cleaning the counter. But that night, when Daniel came to bed, I watched him plug his phone in on his nightstand, something he had always done. Except this time, he placed it face down. It was such a small thing, such a quiet, deliberate thing. I closed my eyes and said nothing. The following week, I noticed he had changed his passcode. I only discovered it by accident. He had asked me to check a sports score on his phone while he was driving. I typed in the old code, The same 4 digits we had used for years, the last 4 numbers of the address where we had our first apartment together. It didn't work. "Oh," he said, eyes on the road. "I changed it a while back. Here." He reached over and unlocked it himself, handed it to me, and kept driving. His voice was perfectly calm. Mine was too. "When did you change it?" I asked. "Few weeks ago. Security thing. The IT department at work sent a memo about personal device safety." It was a reasonable explanation. I found the sports score. I handed the phone back. I looked out the passenger window at the highway passing by and felt something cold settle quietly in my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Just awareness. The kind that, once it arrives, never fully leaves. Daniel had always been punctual. It was one of the things I had loved about him early in our marriage, that quiet reliability. He was the kind of man who called if he was running 10 minutes late, who texted when a meeting ran long, who walked through the front door at 6:30 almost every single evening, loosened his tie, and asked what was for dinner. That dependability had become the rhythm of our life together, which is why I noticed the moment it changed. It started in November, a Tuesday evening. He called at 6 to say he had a last-minute operational review and would be home by 8. I kept his dinner warm. He arrived at 8:15, distracted and distant, and ate without much conversation. I asked how the review went. He said fine. He said it was complicated. He said he was tired. I believed him. The following week, it happened again. Then twice the week after that. By December, Daniel was coming home late 3 times a week. The reasons were always different. A supplier issue, a systems audit, a staffing problem that needed immediate attention. Each explanation was perfectly reasonable on its own. Strung together, week after week, they formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. I began paying attention to details I had never thought to notice before. It was a Thursday evening when I saw her for the first time. Daniel had forgotten his work badge at home, something that had never happened before, and called asking if I could drop it off at the office. I drove downtown without thinking much of it. The logistics company occupied the 4th floor of a glass building near the Scioto River. I took the elevator up, badge in hand, and found Daniel in the hallway outside his office. He was not alone. She was standing beside him. Tall, dark hair pulled back, professional in every visible way. They were looking at something on a tablet together, their heads angled slightly toward each other in that particular way that people do when they have grown comfortable with proximity. Daniel saw me first. Something crossed his face, fast, barely perceptible, before he smiled and took the badge from my hand. "Ellen, this is Rachel," he said. "She just transferred from our Cincinnati branch." Rachel looked at me directly and extended her hand. "Nice to finally meet you," she said. "Daniel talks about you." I shook her hand. I smiled. I said something polite that I cannot now remember. I took the elevator back down alone and sat in my car in the parking garage for 3 full minutes before starting the engine. I could not have explained, at that moment, exactly what I was feeling. I only knew that finally was a strange word for a stranger to use. His shirt collar, for instance. One evening he came home and I caught the faintest trace of something, a scent that wasn't his cologne and wasn't mine. It was subtle, the kind of thing you could easily dismiss if you wanted to. I almost did. Instead, I went to the laundry room and stood there for a long moment, holding his shirt. I put it in the wash and said nothing. Another evening, I noticed a small mark on his jaw. Not a bruise, not a scratch, just a faint impression, the kind that fabric leaves on skin after a long time pressed against it. He walked past me into the bathroom without stopping to kiss me hello the way he once always did. That habit had disappeared so gradually I hadn't noticed exactly when it stopped. I started keeping a mental record, not written down, nothing official, just a quiet, careful accounting in the back of my mind. Dates, times, excuses, the small inconsistencies that individually meant nothing but together were beginning to tell a story. One Friday night, he didn't come home until after 10. He said the team had gone for drinks after a long week. He said he had mentioned it earlier. He hadn't. I was sitting in the living room when he walked in. The house was quiet. I had turned the television off an hour before. He seemed surprised to find me awake. "You didn't have to wait up," he said. "I know," I replied. I looked at him for a moment, really looked at him, and smiled the kind of smile that doesn't reach your eyes. He looked away first. It happened on a Sunday afternoon in early January. Daniel had gone to the gym, or said he had. He left around noon with his gym bag and his earbuds, and a quick kiss on my cheek that barely made contact. I stood at the window and watched his car pull out of the driveway, then turned back to the house and the quiet that had become my most familiar companion. I had been meaning to update our home insurance documents for weeks. Daniel kept the important files in a shared folder on his laptop, which sat open on the desk in our home office. He had always been relaxed about that. The laptop was never off limits, the same way his phone once wasn't. I sat down, opened the browser, and went straight to the insurance company's website. That was all I intended to do. The browser history was open on the screen. He hadn't cleared it. I don't know if it was carelessness or simply the confidence of a man who had never had reason to hide anything in his own home. My eyes moved across the list without meaning to, and then I stopped. A hotel website, a boutique property in downtown Columbus called the Harmon House. I recognized the name. It was the kind of place that appeared in local lifestyle magazines, small and elegant, the sort of hotel people chose when they wanted to feel special. I told myself it meant nothing. Maybe he had looked it up for a work event. Maybe a colleague was staying there. Maybe it was completely innocent. I clicked the link. The page loaded, a confirmation page that had been left open in the browser tab. A reservation under Daniel's name. 2 guests. A junior suite. Check in the following Friday. Check out Saturday morning. I sat very still. Friday was the same day he had told me he would be attending a corporate logistics conference on the other side of the city, an overnight event. He had mentioned it 2 weeks earlier, casually, the way you mention something you expect to go unchallenged. I had packed him an overnight bag without a second thought. I stared at the screen until the words blurred slightly at the edges. Then I took a slow breath and read everything again. The dates, the room type, the name on the reservation. I looked for any detail that might offer a different explanation. Something I had misread. Something that could make this ordinary. There was nothing. I closed the laptop carefully. I walked to the kitchen and filled a glass with water and stood at the sink looking out at the backyard. The January grass was pale and flat. The sky was the color of concrete. I didn't cry. I thought about crying and decided against it. Instead, I made a decision. Quiet and cold and absolute. I was not going to confront him. Not yet. First, I was going to know everything. I had never imagined myself sitting across from a private investigator. It was the kind of thing you read about in magazines or watched in television dramas. Desperate women in dim offices, pushing envelopes of cash across desks. I had always assumed those women were either exaggerating their situations or had failed to try simpler solutions first. I understood them completely now. His name was Gary Hoffman. He operated a small, discreet firm out of a modest office building near the Short North District in Columbus. I found him through a recommendation. A woman I barely knew from my dental office had used him 2 years earlier during her own divorce proceedings. She had mentioned his name once, quietly, in the break room. I had filed it away without knowing why. I called him on a Monday morning while Daniel was at work. The office was nothing like what I had imagined. No dim lighting, no dramatic atmosphere. Just a clean, practical space with framed licenses on the wall, a desk, 2 chairs, and a man in his mid-50s who looked more like a retired accountant than anything else. He spoke slowly and professionally. He asked me to describe the situation without editorializing, just facts, just timeline, just behavior. I laid everything out, the phone, the passcode, the late nights, the hotel reservation, the scent on his collar, the name that kept appearing. Gary listened without interrupting. When I finished, he folded his hands on the desk and told me what his work would involve: physical surveillance, documentation, digital footprint analysis where legally permissible. He explained that the process typically took 2 to 4 weeks, depending on the subject's patterns and level of caution. He quoted me a fee. I had already moved money from my personal savings account that morning. I signed the paperwork and drove home and made lunch and waited. The following 2 weeks were the strangest of my life. I continued living inside my marriage as though nothing had changed. I made dinner. I asked about Daniel's day. I laughed at the appropriate moments during the television programs we watched together in the evenings. I slept beside him every night and stared at the ceiling in the dark and thought about Gary Hoffman parked somewhere across the city, watching. Daniel noticed nothing different about me. That, perhaps, was the most painful discovery of those 2 weeks. Not what Gary would eventually find, but how easy it was to disappear inside a marriage. How a person could be completely invisible to someone who had once claimed to know them better than anyone. The call came on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after our first meeting. Gary's voice was calm and measured, the way I imagined it always was when he delivered news like this. "Mercer," he said, "I have a complete report ready for you. I think you should come in." I already knew what the report would say. I had known for weeks, perhaps longer than I was willing to admit even to myself, but knowing something in the quiet corners of your mind and seeing it documented in photographs and timestamps and written records are two entirely different experiences. I took a breath. "I'll be there tomorrow morning," I said. I hung up the phone and sat at the kitchen table in the house Daniel and I had bought together 8 years earlier. Outside, the January wind moved through the bare trees in the backyard. Inside, everything was perfectly still, and I understood, with absolute clarity, that the woman who walked into Gary Hoffman's office the next morning would not be the same woman who walked back out. Gary Hoffman's office felt smaller on Friday morning. Or perhaps I was simply more aware of the space, the walls, the desk, the manila folder sitting at the center of it, thick, organized, my name written on the tab in clean black ink. I sat down. Gary sat across from me. He didn't offer pleasantries. He understood, I think, that I hadn't come for comfort. He opened the folder and walked me through it methodically. The surveillance had confirmed what I already feared. Daniel and Rachel Donnelly had been meeting regularly for at least 8 months, long before I had begun paying close attention. The locations varied: a restaurant in the short north, a parking garage near his office, and yes, the Harmon House Hotel on more than one occasion. Gary placed photographs on the desk, one at a time. I looked at each one without looking away. I had promised myself I wouldn't look away. Rachel Donnelly was 31 years old. She was tall, professionally dressed in every photograph, and wore her dark hair pulled back from her face. She looked, in every observable way, completely ordinary. That was somehow the hardest part. Not that she was remarkable, but that she wasn't. I studied her face for a long moment, then I set the photograph down. Gary continued. The digital records were where the report became something beyond personal betrayal. Through legally obtained financial documentation, credit card statements that I had access to as Daniel's spouse, Gary had mapped a pattern of expenditures that had no legitimate explanation. Dinners at restaurants Daniel had never mentioned, weekend charges at the Harmon House, a jewelry purchase at a boutique in the short north in November, around the time of our 12th wedding anniversary. I remembered that anniversary. Daniel had given me a gift card to a spa. I set that thought aside and kept listening. But the most significant discovery involved Daniel's corporate expense account. Gary had cross-referenced the dates of hotel stays and dinners with Daniel's submitted expense reports at the logistics company. The pattern was unmistakable. Daniel had been filing reimbursement claims for fabricated business expenses, supplier meetings that hadn't occurred, team lunches with no attendees, travel costs for routes that were never run. The amounts were not enormous individually. Added together over 8 months, they totaled just over $14,000. The company had been funding his affair. I sat with that information for a moment and let it settle completely. This was no longer simply a matter of a broken marriage. Daniel had been committing fraud against his employer, systematically, deliberately, over an extended period of time. And Rachel, who had been promoted within the company on Daniel's direct recommendation 3 months earlier, appeared in the expense records as a named attendee at several of the fabricated meetings. She had known. Gary finished his presentation and folded his hands on the desk. He asked if I had any questions. I had only one. Is all of this documented in a way that would hold up legally? He nodded slowly. Every page in that folder is supported by verifiable records. Dates, receipts, timestamps, photographic evidence. Yes, Mrs. Mercer. It would hold up. I thanked him. I picked up the folder. I shook his hand. I walked out of the office into the cold February air and stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The folder pressed against my side. I had come in looking for the truth. I had found it. And now I had to decide exactly what to do with it. I drove home from Gary Hoffman's office without turning the radio on. The folder sat on the passenger seat beside me, thick, quiet, and absolute. I kept my eyes on the road and my hands steady on the wheel and let the weight of everything I now knew settle into its permanent place inside me. By the time I pulled into our driveway, I had already made my decision. I want to be honest about what that decision was, because it would have been easy, and perhaps understandable, to simply confront Daniel that evening, to place the photographs on the dinner table, to watch his face collapse into the particular expression of a man caught completely. Part of me wanted that, a significant part, but I had spent 3 weeks learning how to be patient, and patience, I had discovered, was its own form of power. I went inside, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with the folder open in front of me. I read through every page carefully, not because I needed to absorb new information, but because I needed to think clearly about what I held in my hands. This was not simply evidence of an affair. This was evidence of financial fraud committed against a corporation. That changed the nature of everything. I called my sister in the evening, without telling her the full details, and asked for the name of the attorney she had used during her own divorce proceedings 3 years earlier. Her name was Patricia Howell, a family law attorney based in Columbus, with a reputation, my sister said, for being thorough and completely unsentimental. I called Patricia Howell's office the following Monday morning and made an appointment. She met with me 2 days later. Patricia Howell was exactly what my sister had described. She sat across from me without warmth or coldness, just precision. She reviewed every document in Gary's folder with systematic attention, asking focused questions and taking careful notes. When she finished, she set her pen down and looked at me directly. "You have an exceptionally well-documented case," she said, "both for divorce proceedings and, separately, for a corporate fraud disclosure. I want to use all of it," I told her. She nodded once, as though she had expected nothing less. We discussed the strategy carefully. The divorce filing would proceed through standard legal channels, with Gary's documentation submitted as evidence of marital misconduct and financial abuse, because redirecting shared marital resources toward an affair qualified, under Ohio law, as exactly that. The fraudulent expense claims represented money that had, in part, come from our household finances, through Daniel's income and corporate standing. The corporate matter was separate, but equally significant. Patricia explained that I had the legal right to report the fraudulent expense claims to the company's compliance department independently. It was not revenge, she was careful to note. It was the disclosure of documented financial misconduct. What the company chose to do with that information was entirely their decision. I understood the distinction. I thought about the $14,000. I thought about the anniversary gift card. I thought about 12 years of dinners and mortgage payments and quiet evenings and the sound of Daniel's easy laugh on a phone call in the hallway. "File everything," I said. Patricia picked up her pen. That afternoon, an anonymous and carefully documented disclosure was prepared and sent to the compliance department of Daniel's logistics company. I drove home in the pale February light and made dinner and waited for the life I had known to finish ending, so the one I would build could begin. Daniel came home on a Tuesday evening in late February, looking like a man who had been hollowed out. I noticed it the moment he walked through the front door, the particular set of his shoulders, not tired, but stunned. The way he moved through the hallway without acknowledging me immediately, as though he needed an extra moment to locate himself inside the familiar space of our home. I was in the kitchen. I had made dinner. I had set the table for two. He stood in the doorway and looked at me. "Something happened at work today," he said. His voice was careful, measured, the voice of a man testing uncertain ground. "What happened?" I asked. He pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. He said that the company's compliance department had launched an internal investigation, that HR had called him into a closed meeting that afternoon, that there were questions, serious questions, about expense reports he had submitted over the past several months. He said it with the particular tone of a man performing innocence for an audience he wasn't entirely sure was convinced. I kept my expression neutral. "That sounds serious," I said. "It's a misunderstanding," he said. "Someone must have flagged the wrong accounts. I'm going to get it sorted out." I placed a serving dish on the table and sat down across from him. We ate dinner. I have thought about that dinner many times since. The absolute strangeness of sitting across a table from someone whose entire constructed world was beginning to collapse, while he remained unaware that the person who had set that collapse in motion was passing him the breadbasket. 3 days later, he was called back into HR. This time, the meeting lasted 2 hours. When he came home, he didn't pretend composure. He walked into the living room and sat on the couch and stared at the floor with his hands clasped between his knees. The investigation had found the irregularities, the fabricated supplier meetings, the false travel claims, the reimbursements tied to personal expenditures. $14,000 documented with a precision that left no room for misunderstanding. Daniel was placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full review. Rachel Donnelly, I learned later through Patricia Howell, had also been called in for questioning. Her promotion, recommended and approved by Daniel, had been flagged as part of the broader review. Her employment was suspended the same week. Daniel did not tell me about Rachel. Not that night. Not the following day. He constructed a version of events in which the expense investigation was a bureaucratic error, a misunderstanding that would be resolved. He spoke about lawyers and appeals and wrongful processes. I listened to all of it. On a Friday morning, 10 days after that first hollowed look in the hallway, I placed Patricia Howell's card on the kitchen table beside his coffee cup. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at me. "Ellen," he said. "Just my name. Nothing attached to it. I've retained a family law attorney," I told him. The divorce filing was submitted on Wednesday. The silence that followed was complete. I watched his face move through several expressions in quick succession. Confusion, then understanding, then something that looked almost like relief before it collapsed into something rawer and harder to name. I picked up my coffee cup and looked at him steadily. "I know everything, Daniel," I said quietly. "Every single thing." And for the first time in months, he had absolutely nothing to say. The divorce proceedings took 4 months. Patricia Howell had told me at the beginning that cases with strong documentation typically moved with more clarity than those built on suspicion alone. She was right. Every motion, every hearing, every submission was anchored by Gary Hoffman's folder. The photographs, the timestamps, the financial records, the cross-referenced expense reports. There was very little room for Daniel's legal team to maneuver. Daniel had hired an attorney, of course, a man named Stephen Barclay, who wore expensive suits and spoke with the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to finding angles in difficult situations. He found very few here. The hearings were not dramatic in the way people imagine courtroom proceedings to be. There was no shouting, no breaking down, no cinematic confrontation across a polished floor. It was measured and procedural and exhausting in the particular way that only prolonged legal processes can be. I sat beside Patricia in a quiet courtroom and watched 12 years of marriage be examined, documented, and methodically dismantled. Daniel sat across the room and rarely looked at me. The financial misconduct evidence was entered as part of the marital proceedings under Ohio's equitable distribution laws. Patricia argued, clearly and with extensive documentation, that Daniel had systematically diverted marital resources to fund a relationship he had deliberately concealed. The fraudulent expense claims, while a separate corporate matter, demonstrated a pattern of financial deception that had directly impacted our shared household stability. The judge, a composed woman in her 60s named Judge Carol Whitfield, reviewed everything with visible thoroughness. She asked pointed questions of both legal teams. She requested additional documentation on 2 separate occasions. She gave no indication of her thinking until the morning of the final hearing. Her ruling was delivered without theatrical emphasis. Judge Whitfield awarded me the family home outright. She determined that Daniel's pattern of financial deception warranted an unequal distribution of assets in my favor, 65% of our shared savings and investment accounts. She also ruled that I was entitled to a portion of Daniel's retirement fund, calculated against the duration of the marriage and the documented financial harm. Additionally, and perhaps most significantly, she ordered Daniel to reimburse the marital estate for a calculated portion of the funds he had redirected, money that Patricia had carefully traced back to joint accounts and shared income. Stephen Barclay appealed 2 of the rulings. Both appeals were denied within 6 weeks. On the day the final decree was signed, I sat in Patricia Howell's office while she walked me through the settlement documents. She was as precise and unsentimental as she had been at our first meeting, which I appreciated more than I could adequately express. When we finished, she extended her hand across the desk. "You handled this exceptionally well," she said. I shook her hand and thanked her for everything. I drove home, to my home, and parked in the driveway and sat in the car for a few minutes before going inside. I thought about the Tuesday evening Daniel had walked through the front door looking hollowed out. I thought about the hotel reservation on a laptop screen. I thought about a name appearing on a phone notification on an ordinary Wednesday night, Rachel, and how something that small had been the beginning of all of this. I thought about 12 years. Then I got out of the car, unlocked the front door, and walked into the quiet house that was entirely, unconditionally mine. 1 chapter remained, and it belonged only to me. Spring arrived the week after the final decree was signed. I noticed it the morning I woke up and lay still for a moment, aware of the space beside me, aware of the absence, and felt for the first time something that wasn't grief filling that space, something that felt, cautiously and carefully, like peace. Alone, but not lonely. That distinction mattered more than I had expected. I returned to work full-time at the dental office in April. My colleagues knew that something significant had changed in my personal life. I had been quieter than usual for months, but I had shared very little, and they respected that. There is a particular dignity in handling difficult things without broadcasting them, and I had come to value that dignity deeply. I heard about Daniel through mutual acquaintances, the way you inevitably do in a city the size of Columbus, when you have shared 12 years of a life with someone. The logistics company had concluded its internal investigation in March. Daniel had been formally terminated for gross misconduct. The company had pursued partial financial recovery through legal channels, a process that had added considerable weight to the burden he was already carrying. Rachel Donnelly had also lost her position. Whatever they had built together in those hotel rooms and borrowed evenings did not survive the exposure. By all accounts, the relationship had ended somewhere in the wreckage of the investigation. Two people who had dismantled something real in pursuit of something dishonest, and found themselves left with neither. I did not feel satisfaction when I heard this. I want to be precise about that, because satisfaction would have required me to still be invested in his story. And I had spent those quiet spring mornings carefully, deliberately, releasing my investment in Daniel Mercer's story so that I could fully inhabit my own. What I felt was something closer to clarity. In May, a small local publication ran a piece on workplace ethics and the intersection of personal relationships and corporate misconduct. A journalist named Andrea Cole had reached out to me through Patricia Howell's office, asking if I would be willing to speak briefly and anonymously as someone who had navigated exactly that intersection. I agreed. The article ran on a Thursday. My name did not appear. My words did. When the journalist asked whether I regretted any part of how I had handled the situation, I thought about the question carefully before answering. I lost a husband, I told her, but I gained something I hadn't realized I was missing. She asked me what that was. I looked out the window of the coffee shop where we were sitting, at the spring street, at the ordinary people moving through their ordinary Thursday, and I answered honestly. I thought about a Thursday evening in a parking garage, sitting alone in my car after shaking the hand of a woman who had called me finally, as though she already knew exactly who I was. I looked at the journalist and answered honestly. I stopped being the last person in the room to know the truth about my own life, I said. That's what I got back, and I will never give it up again. And that, in the end, was worth every single thing it had cost. If this story touched you in any way, please give it a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel, because more stories like this one are coming. You deserve to know you are not alone.